And joining us today in our Book Talk segment, great to welcome a man who's written a book about a sport that continues to be very popular. It's been around a long time. Its book is called The Squared Circle, Life and Death in Professional Wrestling. We're joined today by David Shoemaker, who contributed to both Deadspin and Grantland. And David, good to talk to you. How are you today?
I'm doing great, man. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, great to have a chance to chat a little bit about wrestling. I grew up in New York, and my earliest memories of wrestling as a kid, I always saw those newspaper ads in the I guess the sports section for Bruno Sammartino and Chief Jay Strongbow at Madison Square Garden. So I remember those guys, and you write about them a little bit, don't you?
Oh yeah, man, I did. I spent a lot of time in the New York Public Library looking at old newspapers and researching all that kind of stuff. There was no shortage of write-ups about them, although the sports pages are always a little bit trying to keep a little distance between the real sports and the pro wrestling. Nobody quite knew how to handle it, but there were always great articles over the years about cultural critics saying, "I can't believe wrestling keeps selling out Madison Square Garden. Like, this is just, it doesn't make any sense at all."
They wouldn't do, yeah, you're right. They wouldn't do articles on it, particularly as a sports article, but there'd always be that ad there that they would be at the Garden or the Felt Forum or wherever they would be. But I remember those two names. I know there were others too, but it's Bruno Sammartino. He was kind of the Hulk Hogan of his day, wasn't he?
Oh yeah, Bruno was absolutely one of the greats, and he comes from this long tradition that's kind of specific to New York, although there was some of it in California too, where immigrants would come in waves, and then generally by the second or third generation, they had enough money to start going to things like pro wrestling, and you would see that the WWF, or then WWF champion, would almost always be representative of the sort of like growing middle class of whatever class of immigrants came up, and Bruno was one of those guys. There were other guys before him, Greek guys and Latin American guys, or Latino guys, and it was a really cool series of superstars, but Bruno was the one that sort of crossed over into the modern era, and he was just absolutely one of the best.
I remember Channel 9 in New York used to show wrestling on Saturday mornings before there was cable, obviously, and the channel, I guess NBC had it for a while on the network, but Channel 9 would do it pretty regularly, which was great programming for them. It always did good ratings, that and the roller derby.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, wrestling has been a staple for the sort of TV whenever it was like looking for stuff to put on. I mean, in the 50s, when television first went national, wrestling was one of the first things they had on. It was the most popular national sport, according to a lot of people, because they were already airing it locally, and so they had the ability to just put it on nationally. But also because it was, of all the sports back in the 50s, like, it was the one that you could film. You just set up a camera at the top of the arena.
Right.
You don't have to track the ball or move back and forth up and down the court. But yeah, I mean, there was wrestling regionally after that for decades, and it always did really well. If you were watching in New York, you thought that you were in the center of the wrestling universe. If you were watching in Florida, if you were watching in California, you thought that what you were watching was the most important thing. And it, a couple of people, but Vince McMahon most famously realized what cable television was going to do to take wrestling national, and he jumped right on it.
His father, I guess, was in the business for a while before that. Didn't he kind of start it, the wrestling business?
Yeah, I mean, his dad was running the New York region right before he handed it off to Vince. But before that, Vince Sr. had been, he ran the D.C. territory for a long time, and all up and down the Northeast. He was the sort of local mogul at that point in the 60s and 70s, and was a real power player in the pro wrestling world. The funny story about him, though, is that back in the 50s, when he was working in Washington, D.C., there's a number of newspaper articles where he pretty openly discussed wrestling being fake, which, a lot of people think his son was the first one to admit that in the 80s, but no, it was pretty open secret. If you wanted to just kind of read between the lines a little bit, as far back as Vince Sr. in the 50s.
You talk a lot about it in the book, the early days, and wrestling, in a sense, the business of wrestling is a regional, almost a franchise business, or at least was. I don't know if it's still that way. I guess it is more regional, right? But you kind of develop your own area, territory, and your own characters.
There's still some of that. It's certainly more of a thing of the past now that the WWE is,
right,
the monopoly almost. And there are still a lot of local wrestling federations, although none of them are nearly as prominent as they would have been in the 70s and 80s. But yeah, I mean, it's always been a situation where, you have wrestling in Texas, you have wrestling in Florida, you have wrestling in Minnesota, and then, slowly the WWF became the big time, and it's where all the wrestlers aspired to. And now, they're training guys from day one down in Orlando. So,
in doing the research for the books, The Squared Circle, it seems to me, I don't follow it that closely, just kind of peripherally, but it seems to be more, if you want to call it acting or storylines now, as opposed to action in the ring. I guess that when they do WrestleMania, there's more action in the ring than the old days, where there was more actual action. Am I right about that? I'm talking about storylines today as compared to years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, part of that's just a sort of self-awareness that the business has taken on, to the point where, like, if they're going to acknowledge that the fans know that it's sort of a put-on, then that kind of necessarily diminishes some of what happens in the ring, and so it's more about these kind of long storylines and the motivations behind the fight and that sort of thing. Certainly way back when, like you're talking about Bruno Sammartino earlier, I mean, for all intents and purposes, they put it on like a legitimate sporting event,
Right.
Maybe his opponent was, slightly too good to be true, just some monster from afar, who had special powers or whatever, but, the presentation was very kind of legitimate.
What was the first big wrestling star? Was that Gorgeous George? I know you write about it in the book. Was he the first... the Babe Ruth of
there
wrestling?
were certainly guys, there was Gotch, there were a million guys that were, not a million, there were a handful of guys who were national sports celebrities in the early part of the 20th century, but Gorgeous George was definitely the first one that realized how you become a superstar. I mean, he realized if you bleach your hair and put on a robe, if everybody's booing you, if everybody hates you, then everybody's paying attention. And, he influenced guys like Muhammad Ali and James Brown and Bob Dylan, of all people. I think that the lesson is that, if you really want to transcend, you got to put yourself aside and kind of become a superstar. You can't just wait for the superstar to come to you. And because of that, he was, the first mega star in pro wrestling and influenced everybody that came after him.
Yeah, I know. I guess in the early days of TV, he was maybe a better analogy would be the Arnold Palmer, since he was the first TV wrestler, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'd heard before
Absolutely.
in interviews, Muhammad Ali said he kind of patterned his whole act of being loud and talking and the whole thing in boxing in the early '60s on Gorgeous George. So he was directly influenced by him, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's this lesson in, like, sort of deliberate antagonism, I mean, if everybody's paying attention, that's all you can ask for. It's almost more important than the actual performance. But yeah, I mean, Muhammad Ali cited him frequently. I mean, he said that he saw him when he was a kid and just that changed everything for him.
Talk a little bit about the sport as it is today. I guess it's as popular as ever. I know those WrestleManias still do huge business on cable TV. Is it as popular today as it was before?
I mean, wrestling's always been a cyclical thing, and I cover some of that in my book, that dating back to the 20s, I mean, there's just these sort of ups and downs, and people try to explain them, and there's no real good way to explain it. I mean, wrestling is not as big today as it was, say, in, like, the 90s, or before that, when Hulk Hogan was running wild in the 80s. But it goes up and it goes down, and I think that there's every reason to believe that, it's doing really, really well right now. One of the big problems is there's just so many more things to pay attention to.
Yeah.
But I think that there's every reason to believe that there will be another moment in time where people are surprised to be paying attention to pro wrestling.
I know McMahon came out with that wrestling. I guess it was an internet channel, right? Not too long ago. I don't know how well that's doing.
Yeah, the WWE Network is out now. It's like, you can watch it on your iPad or your laptop or, hook it up to your TV. And, as somebody who spends a ton of time writing about wrestling, I don't know, maybe this will be surprising, but I kind of thought that I wasn't so excited about it because I feel like I already had so much wrestling in my life. But, man, it's amazing, the stuff that just the old wrestling matches that they put up on there to watch them in, relative high definition and to see that stuff. It's really cool, and wrestling has always been at the forefront of these technological shifts. There were the first big sport on national TV. They were, one of the main reasons that cable TV took off in the 80s, and
sure.
and I think that Vince is really ahead of the curve on this kind of unique, just computer platform network.
Well, a lot of great stories in the book called The Squared Circle, Life, Death, and Professional Wrestling. Excuse me. We've been talking with David Shoemaker today. And David, give out a website. We can get a hold of you with the book.
You can always find me on Twitter at AKA The Masked Man, and all the appropriate links for the book and everything are there. But you can find the book on Amazon or wherever else. And I write pretty regularly for a website called Grantland. It's an ESPN website, and Grantland.com. Definitely worth checking out.
Great. David, pleasure to talk to you. Good luck with the book, and hopefully we can talk to you again sometime.
I'd love to. Thanks.